Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View. Today is our Millennial Roundtable edition, and I am your guest host, Chelsey Youman. I am so excited for you guys to be joining us today because we have an incredible lineup and panel today. The first hour, we will have Jonathan Teague. He is the Minister to Married Adults. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Hey, Chelsey. Good to be with you today.
Always great to hear from you, Jonathan. And then we also have this first hour, Annie Brown. She's the Government Grant Program Manager with Youman Coalition, which is, of course, my organization. It's a pro-life organization, so it's always a treat when Annie gets to join us. Thanks for coming, Annie.
Hi, Chelsey. It's good to be here again, round two.
Round two, but you know what? You're a pro by now. So
I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you guys. And of course, there's no shortage of national news happening. There's actually been a ton to unpack from the last week. So some of our articles are going to go back as far as last Monday. We're going to start with the Supreme Court hearings. They heard the Texas Heartbeat Act, which I know you've all heard much about by now. It was enacted September 1st and has not stopped making waves, frankly, across the nation. I know because I personally worked on that bill, as did Annie. We advocated for it, and we get calls constantly to keep talking about it and analyzing it. So we're going to do that on the show because there have been some really exciting and important updates there. We're also going to move on and talk about this corporate vaccine mandate. President Biden has officially given the country a deadline to fall into line. Corporations some are responding very robustly by suing the Biden administration, and then others are going to comply. And, we've really seen the biggest backlash, I think, in the airline industry. So want to talk about that. A little bit later on the show, we're going to talk about parental rights as it relates to education, the Virginia governor's race, and of course, Richard Lim will be joining us. He's our historian, and also my former friend from the federal government. He's really got an incredible mind on some of these political issues, so we'll be turning to him for his expertise. But let's start with the Supreme Court. I really want to talk about this. You guys know, because not only did I advocate for this bill and work on this bill, but I was able to attend the Supreme Court last week. There was a rally outside, a press conference with the Texas Attorney General's office who defended the bill. And all the attorneys were there, of course, at the hearing arguing this case. And so I want to break it down because I think the news has been all over the map in the way it covers this. And we always want to talk about truth on the show and what's really going on. And so for those who don't know, the Texas Heartbeat Act is the first Heartbeat Act out of 13, maybe more now, to successfully be enacted. And it's a bill that protects children in the womb once they have a heartbeat from being aborted. It protects their lives. But the only reason this bill is different and successfully enacted is because it's extremely unique. The bill is only enforced through private citizens being allowed to sue abortion providers. That could be, for instance, the grandmother of a child who is aborted, the father of someone who is aborted, or an organization that's pro-life and cares about these issues, wanting to protect life, suing the abortion providers. So abortion providers did what they do best besides aborting children, which is they shut down. Anytime there's a regulation enacted on them, they shut down, they create their own harm and say, look, there's no more access to abortion. That injures women, and they sue. So the issues before the Supreme Court last week was really only two issues. One is the civil lawsuit enforcement mechanism for a bill allowed. And then two, the United States sued Texas in an unprecedented lawsuit out of thin air. They don't really have an injury. They don't really have a meaningful ability to sue. There's no statutory right to sue. And so that issue is before the Supreme Court. So I wanted to break down the hearings just a little bit with you two and say, first, I think there were some very hard-hitting questions that came from the Supreme Court justices. If you listen to liberal media, you would assume that all the justices have a 6 conservative voting block and then a 3 liberal voting block, and this is a done deal. That's frankly not the case. What we saw was Justices Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett, the most recent addition to the Supreme Court, come out heavy-hitting. And I think that on the civil enforcement mechanism, essentially the court is saying, you guys circumvented us in order to regulate abortion. You decided we're not a part of the equation. You're trying to keep it in state courts, and they don't like that. They don't like the ability not to rule on that issue. So I wanted to start there, and Jonathan, we'll start with you. Have you picked up on that from some of the analysis you were able to read? And, what are your initial thoughts on the court's response to the civil enforcement mechanism side?
Yeah, for sure. I would appeal to you and Annie in terms of the legal space because I love the insight that and the clarity really to Chelsey that you're bringing to what the network or the framework really of the problem is, Annie, and just this idea of to some extent, I suppose one of the implications we have wrestling with here is what can states do within the judicial framework? What is their purview? What should be their purview? I think it really does highlight, and I appreciate what you said about Planned Parenthood effectively shutting down. That was a great day for the window of time that was. And I think it also speaks to, again, we've got some overreach issues here with the federal government. We got the federalization here of the abortion question. I think, just for instance, if you go back and look at the SNL sketch, that's their sketch that's trending right now all over social media, when the young lady came out on the Weekend Update and was basically they were trying to do a parody of the whole awkwardness of the abortion conversation, and it sort of backdooring back into the privacy of it, and yet it's always fascinating to me how abortion in a more progressive conversation is always posited in that's private for me, but then we immediately bring it into the public space to litigate it and to legislate it, and I think that contrast is so incredibly dubious. As what we're trying here effectively to do is to really draw a box around what is true about a human life and what's not. And then from there, what space does the government have to speak into that and where do they not? So, I think from a legislative or really rather from a judicial standpoint, Chelsey, I think what it's doing is maybe, and again, the two of you, I would definitely appeal to you all in this space for more of the legal insight. But it sure does seem to me as a layman like a curtain's being pulled back a little bit in the culture of where judicial overreach really has become a reality, and the politicization, the federalization of this issue, and honestly, the pivot to protect abortion at all costs really seems to be the driver behind so much of the pushback from progressives and on the left.
You're so right, Jonathan. I would only add to what you're saying in that, the justices in 1973 with Roe versus Wade, when they rendered that, they removed the ability to really regulate abortion from the states. They removed it from state judiciaries who are sovereign elected officials, in that branch of government. But then they also removed it from the state authority, and they kind of federalized the issue, which you alluded to. And it's so ultimately ironic as us who worked on this bill, because they don't like when that same work is done against them,
right.
When it's kind of removed from their hands and driven into state court. Of course, we know abortion providers and women, they'll have their day in court. It just requires it to be done through the state court system first, essentially. And that seemed to be really troublesome for the federal courts. And I'll just add to this analysis a little bit. One thing to note is that really there are hundreds of years of court precedents and rules to even bringing a lawsuit at play. And for the court to rule against the Texas Heartbeat Act on this issue would require them to overrule their own rules for the court.
Right.
So it's interesting. We do have one of those breaks coming up. Stay tuned. We'll be back with more from Annie after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Last week, I talked about the cancel culture on college campuses. I ended my commentary with an encouraging action by Professor Robert George at Princeton, who sponsored a lecture that has been canceled at MIT. The typical reaction to that news has been, that's great, but that's an exception, not the rule. While that is true, there are more and more examples of people willing to push back against the cancel culture mob. The most visible example these days is Dave Chappelle. We can't support his gross humor, but we can support his desire to push back against the trolls trying to push his series off of Netflix. Following up on the attacks, he reminded everyone that the cancel culture mob has canceled Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, along with lots of people who aren't celebrities who have been attacked for simply saying gender is a fact. Another example is Bill Maher. He is criticized because he is weary of a younger generation acting like they're victims. More recently, he argued that words matter and that words like hate, victim, and phobic have been completely misused. Barry Weiss, who served as the op-ed editor of the New York Times, came on CNN to push back against the host about all the cancel culture offenses. We may disagree with her on many issues, though I do have a copy of her latest book on how to fight anti-Semitism. We should also support Boston Celtics star Enes Kanter, who is one of the few NBA stars to criticize China. This Muslim from Turkey has spoken out against slave labor and the 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. As Christians, we might not agree with any of the people I just mentioned, but we should support their right of free speech, and perhaps we should learn a lesson of courage from them. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. And Annie and Jonathan and I have been breaking down a little bit about the Supreme Court oral arguments from last week with the Texas Heartbeat Act. And we were discussing how essentially for the justices to rule against the act, they would have to be making an exemption that has not been made for any other litigants before the court in hundreds of years. You know, they're going against their own standing, jurisdiction, case and controversy doctrines. And those are all judicially created doctrines that are meant to limit the court's power and authority to hear cases. I always say you can't just file a case. You have to have an injury. You have to have the right set of standards in place, the threshold requirements that you meet to bring a case. And then you really get to the merits of the case, which in this instance would be the ability of a state to protect an innocent beating human heart from abortion. So Annie, when I say it that way, based on the analysis you've seen, you know, what are your thoughts from the hearing last week? I know we said that many of the justices had hard-hitting questions. Was there anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So, you know, one thing that you've been hearing a lot of, especially coming from those questions and the hard-hitting questions is, well, what will this lead to? And so, you know, and I think that there are some valid points to be made, and I think that it can be hard to distinguish between, you know, fear-mongering on the left and kind of what reality could be, you know. So one of the things I consider is, well, you know, if we do open this up for a loophole, a legal loophole, you know, but say a state like Seattle, you know, or sorry, a state like Seattle, Washington, and
it could be its own state. They have their own, so they have their own city there now.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
But yeah, I mean, if they wanted to, you know, use it as a cudgel against churches, say, who wanted, let's just say churches didn't want to perform same-sex unions. Well, you could have Washington pass a law, stating, well, you could potentially have litigation and you can have lawsuits, through this very same mechanism. Or say, if Oregon wanted to ban gun sales, well, you can't go directly to the Supreme Court, but what you could do is potentially have people circumvent the system and, of course, file suits against individuals who are buying or selling ammunition or buying and selling arms. And so, I think that there's some arguments to be made as to why that might not happen. But I don't know. I think it's a real obstacle that we might need to deal with going forward. Or, is that a possibility that we want to deal with?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, because that was the number one criticism of this civil lawsuit, is that other states can wield this. They're arguing, or the justices questioned, against deprivation of other constitutional rights. And of course, I'm not an attorney before the Supreme Court arguing this, but there are very good legal answers to that. And one of them is, first and foremost, that there's a statute passed called 1983 that specifically Congress allows us to bring those suits in federal courts already. So the Bill of Rights, that's already an ability to preemptively challenge. And that was explicitly done by Congress. And the question here, from a separation of powers concept, Jonathan, is, is it really up to the justices to make that decision, or Congress? Right. And, the rules of law state it's Congress's job to say we're going to create that ability. And then the other issue here is, of course, you can always raise your constitutional rights on defense in state court, which the abortion providers could do here. They just have to work their way up to the Supreme Court from there, which they don't want to do, and they're not used to doing, because they've received every exemption under the law for 50 years. They're not used to having to play by the same rules as everyone else. And then finally, what I'll say is, when it comes to this argument that other states could use it to preemptively deprive people of their rights, is that's already been done. And I really wish the attorneys had said this. They did an incredible job on Monday, but we saw this. This is from the playbook of the LGBT movement, where they passed non-discrimination ordinances at the local level or state level non-discrimination statutes, where their threat of lawsuits to private citizen enacting their religious beliefs, so against wedding photographers, pastors, churches, we represented so many organizations during that era that just shut down because of the threat of liability and unknown lawsuits coming their way. Catholic Charities couldn't afford to operate and have the threat of liability for not being willing to place children with adoptive parents who are same-sex marriage. They just shut down in multiple states, and the Supreme Court didn't say anything. And so for me, that was a point of frustration. Jonathan, when I kind of raised that to you, what are your initial thoughts or responses? Well,
and just parenthetically, Chelsey, I think we'd love to know how cool it was to sit in and listen to the Supreme Court deliberate too. That sounds like
it was really
that sounds like legit. I know you can't take pictures and stuff, so we just have to take your word that you were there. But it's I bet that was an amazing experience, and it really does. But it amplifies the reality of, again, going back to what is our construct in the American experience. We're seeking to have a separation of powers. In a federalist context in particular here, what we're trying to ensure, Chelsey, like you just so well pointed out, that the Congress is there to legislate. The judiciary is there to, I might be out of my depth in saying it this way, but effectively, just kind of in a ninth grade social studies kind of way, the judiciary is there to ensure that those laws aren't punitive, that they're executed properly, that they're just for people. And the court needs to be functioning in that capacity. And again, this goes back to, like you said, a 50-year-old problem where the court has particularly been weaponized and politicized. And as we see a ballasting back towards a more conservative bench, literally, that's the nature, and people need to understand this in the audience. That's the nature of conservatism. Is it's less more about all the new fun stuff we want to try, and more about pulling back in and restraining to get the government to do fewer things, so that we can amplify, and that we can honestly give a greater highlight to certainly our states, but then also people's individual rights and freedoms. That being said, and Annie and I were talking about this on the break, I think it also exacerbates the reality that in a certain political ideology, Chelsey, we're still having a hard time treating this little baby in the womb as a person. And so categorically, when we don't want to make them people, and therefore exposing them and entitling them to the rights that we all have today as people, when you relegate them to not that, it allows you to sort of dance legally in these ways from a semantic, terminology, all these different things. When you make that person a person, it changes the conversation. One of the things I love about the heartbeat bill is that it's a big right hook, right? It's a massive step towards getting the culture and ultimately our judiciary to validate what we know God's word already says, which is that that's a little baby in the womb, and they deserve and they are entitled to the rights that the people outside of the womb get to enjoy as well.
You're so right. Annie, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I'm going to say something. Well, this might be, a little bit controversial to mention, but the president of, I think it was, let me just pull this up here. It was the Texas right to choice of some sort. It's some sort of pro-choice organization, but the president, she said, well, Texans have been forced to remain pregnant against their will. And I find that an utterly bizarre statement to kind of go along the lines of, that's like saying a city that's forced to manage or work with homelessness, is doing so against their will. Well, it's a human being. So to touch on your point with it's still a baby in the womb, it's like it's still a human being. You don't get to end another life because of convenience. Of course, if you take it to that extreme level, people would be shocked to say such a thing. But the logic. It still follows.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, that's something that's really stood out to me in, probably the close to 100 interviews or more I've done since September is just the absolute failure to acknowledge the scientific and medical reality that it is a child, a living human child in the womb. And, even last week, I should caveat this by saying I was not in the room for the hearing because of COVID restrictions. Only the attorneys were. We were listening outside the courthouse, but there were ralliers on both sides out there, and they were pretty rambunctious, as you can imagine. The rumor has it, though, because there were not as many pro-abortionists rallying as I expected. There were probably 100 to 150 on our side, maybe a little bit less than 100 on theirs, is that the abortion lobby pays a lot of the protesters to come, and they spent all their money on the next abortion hearing, which will be in a month. I'm about to talk about that. But really the sentiment from one of the people interviewing me was, don't you know this is hard for women? Acknowledge that. And I said, of course it's difficult. We serve these women. We love these women. We want them to be empowered and to have assistance and help when they need it most. But the answer can never be kill the human child. It just can't. Right. And I think that kind of resonated with her. She actually quoted it, which they never quote my good quotes. So I was excited about that. But, really the point here being that we have humanity to protect. And no matter the outcome, I do wish the justice's response to the heartbeat bill wasn't, how dare you offend my oh holy court. I wish it was, we need to help children. But it's not. Don't forget, no matter how this goes down, how this decision is rendered on the Texas Heartbeat Act, Dobbs is on the horizon. That's December 1st. It's a case out of Mississippi, and it is the first outright challenge to Roe. It's the first time the court is being asked to overturn Roe in 30 years. So everybody, please be praying. You right now, listen and pray for the court as they decide that, because our chance is not over. Life can be protected. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View. Today is our Millennial Roundtable edition, and I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. I'm so grateful to be with you guys today, and also to have just a stellar panel. We have so excited to be hearing from Annie Brown with Human Coalition. Thanks for being here, Annie.
I'm glad to be here.
And we've also got Jonathan Teague in the studio. Thanks for being here, Jonathan.
You bet, Chelsey. Enjoying the conversation today.
Me too. We have been talking about the Supreme Court hearings on the Texas Heartbeat Act and our experience there, but we're going to be moving on now to discuss this corporate mandate issued by President Biden over the last week for vaccine mandates for corporations that have over 100 people. We are starting to see the fallout from that mandate occur, not just in the corporate world, but among friends and family, really. I mean, this is as personal as it gets because, after all, it is about your own personal health choices. So I want to dive right in. But before we go there, if you're interested in reading these articles or any of our topics today, don't forget you can go to pointofview.net where you can read these articles, or you can watch live on Facebook, Point of View Radio on Facebook. So you can do both those things. But let's turn now. I picked an article to discuss the mandates because after my flights were canceled for 24 hours and I had the travel day from where, I thought that the airlines was a really great place to start because it's such a prime example of the fallout of the vaccine mandate. And so we'll start there. Really, American Airlines was the culprit this time, but before that, it was Southwest Airlines. I'm still hearing secret rumors of pilot strikes. So just be aware that as the holidays are coming, you guys, that this is going to get a little bit crazy. But American Airlines was forced to cancel more than 2,000 flights over last weekend. And of course, the first thing they did was lie. They lied to everybody. They said, this isn't about mandates. This is because all of our pilots and stewardesses are out of hours. So they can't fly because it's the end of the month. Well, those 300 more cancellations occurred on Monday the 1st. So we know that now not to be true. But instead of really owning this, not just in the public eye, but to their consumers, people who paid hundreds of dollars to get somewhere important, they just lied to everybody. And so I thought this was just such a poignant example of a whole lot of mess for us to break down. So are you guys here with me to do this? Because I'd love to get started. I'm going to start with first, really to me, what the macro issue here is that for me, corporations, 10, 15 years ago, this almost would have been unheard of because corporations were primarily driven not by ideology or political views or fear of cancel culture, and sometimes not even necessarily PR, although that's, don't hold me to that. But mostly they cared about capitalism, corporate profit, and their consumers and their consumer experiences, because consumers would essentially, if they have a bad experience with one group, go somewhere else. And that, that capitalistic competition in the market really prevents these types of things from happening. They would care maybe more about getting consumers the right prices and over to them, which is how Delta responded, by the way. Delta brought in fleets of huge airplanes last minute on Sunday and Monday because all of the American passengers were jumping ship from American flights, getting reimbursed for their money there and going over to Delta, who was reliable at the time. That's how corporate America should, I think, respond. Annie, I'm going to start with you. What are your thoughts, hearing me say that as a, obviously not a happy consumer?
Well, first, I think that that's a fantastic segue topic from our previous discussion, where my body, my choice really only goes so far, right. With a certain group. But also, well, first of all, it's frustrating because they assume the very worst of the consumers in that they don't believe that we can see through it. I mean, it's just so blatant. It's so blatant how it's completely made up, and the things that they're doing to cover the stories to make it, sound palatable to those in favor of the mandates. But I think the most telling part of this is that pushing back works, and it's so nice to see some pushback. It's so nice to see them stand up because, I mean, Southwest had to cave, and no doubt that's around the pike, I think, for as more and more airlines, follow this trend, because as it gives people, it energizes the base that is against these mandates, and they don't want to comply, and they don't want to be required by the state and federal governments to fall in suit. So I think that it energizes people to fight back, and I think it just shows that fighting back works.
Right. So presumably, if companies, I was talking about the corporate side, but you raised such a great point on the privacy side. I mean, I've never been in a job interview where they asked my vaccine status on any vaccine, including polio. I mean, the original, the OG vaccines, the original vaccines, but that this is not only something that employers are having to delve into on a private side, with the private decisions made by their employees, but employees having the understanding of how important this moment in time is to be vocal. Jonathan, do you agree?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I just think here's what we need to do is if we would just federalize all the airlines, it would just, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding, right? But that's
it worked well for the TSA.
Right, yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's a fantastic, everybody let the government run it all. But again, I think where the misstep, so if we zoom out for a moment, the misstep that I think President Biden made in how quick he was to initiate the vaccine mandate was either this was the intended ripple effect of sort of chaos, as meant to distract maybe from the fact that COVID, in a large degree within the population, is mitigating itself as people are surprised making the decisions for their health care. I mean, we can zoom further out if you want to and go even back to the implications of Obamacare and how really once we opened that door 11 years ago and now we walk through it, we're empowering the government more and more and more, right? So to Annie's point, it really isn't your body and it sure isn't your choice. I mean, we can posture that if we want to, but that's just language. That's rhetoric. The reality is once you introduce the vaccine mandate into the space, certainly for the federal workers, the amount of implications that had, and I think that was a patronizing move politically, by the way, because what it effectively attempted to do was to try to introduce federal control of this issue, not state control, federal control of this issue into the workplace in any way that they possibly can. And I just think that Joe Biden ran on this conciliatory tone that like, hey, trust me, I'm going to get everybody to hang out together. And again, I think it just exposes, Chelsey, kind of what you were saying earlier on the corporate side. I think it exposes how sensitive that nerve is in corporate America right now to not be behind on whatever the next amazingly awesome cultural statement's supposed to be. And so we're throwing money at advertising campaigns. We're throwing, by the way, and all of those refunded tickets, let's not remember at home, some of that is subsidized through the PPE dollars that those organizations sent. So actually you and I reimburse those tickets to our friends as the taxpayer. So let's be clear. We understand here that the airlines are flying to a large degree today because of taxpayer subsidy through what was passed last year. And so I think rather than de-incentivizing business, and I would think it's a great point about Delta literally flying in, right, and fixing this, is when we become customer facing again, we become consumer facing. We can solve this problem. Like we can be rational about these things, but when you de-incentivize me from doing that by controlling it through government mandate, to Annie's point, I'm out. So there's a ton of people that say just surely on the virtue of you telling me I have to do it, I don't now want to do it. And I think it's what creates this real house of cards that falls, that everybody just gets frustrated and we all sit in the airport together upset.
Right. I mean, everybody is frustrated, which leads to one thing. So first, I would love to see corporations come out of, they never will. I don't know if they'll ever go back, but they've officially become another liberal institution. I mean, it's not really about what I said, capitalism, but consumer experience or profitability. I mean, these are just bad business decisions. And if their boards and consumers helped progress them back towards consumer experience, I think that we would see growth here, but instead they're politicized. And it is frustrating for the consumers. What I don't want to see happen, Annie, is consumers lowering their standards. I think I saw an article that said, well, this is just the new reality. And, I have people in my life who are like, this is just the world we live in now. And that's really a nice sentiment. But you know what? I think the response joke I saw to that first comment about lowering our standards is I'm sure that food lines in socialist countries, that was propaganda
Right.
for them. I mean, that would be a great poster for a food line, because I don't want us as America to lower our standards and expect 6-month-long waiting processes for things and not to be able to get places on time. I mean, I really think that we should be thriving as a better society, and that American wants their economy to be flourishing. Real quick, Annie, do you agree or?
No, I definitely agree. I agree with that. And I think part of that too, I mean, instead of having these mandates come from the top down, from a capitalist perspective, imagine if the different airlines decided for themselves what, from their own corporate perspective, if Delta says, okay, we are going to require vaccines, and see what happens. And if they all kind of follow suit, I think that'd be one thing. I think what really rubs people the wrong way is that it's coming from the government.
That's right. Well, don't forget, these suits have been challenged in court, so it's not over till it's over. But stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsey, Youman, your host today, and we just finished talking a little bit about these corporate vaccine mandates, but I'm going to move on now, and we're going to discuss really what is something that has become a national topic. And if you had told me that last election cycle we would be talking about parental rights so much in 2021, I would not have believed you. Out of all my years in politics, it's just not something many people have seemed to care about. People care about it, but it has been pushed to the forefront in the last year, really on the education side of things. So that's where I really want to spend some time today unpacking. There was an article that came out. You can go to pointofview.net and read a little bit more about this op-ed that came out that basically is talking about parental rights in the education context. And it is saying what we all know to be true. Parents, I've never seen more well-attended school board meetings in my life. And as a political nerd, I love to go to city council meetings, town halls, you name it. But at the local level, that's not really where it's happening. But that's not true anymore. In the last year, we have seen arrests made. We've seen outbursts. We've seen cursing. School board meetings have become very contentious, and everybody's watching for a few reasons. One, backlash on critical race theory. Now, you will hear everybody, if you hear the talking point, critical race theory as a subject is not being taught in schools. That is technically true, because critical race theory is a PhD level philosophy that's taught, but components of that, of the basics of critical race theory have started to be integrated into certain curriculums. We've seen schools doing things like we saw some schools in Buffalo filter kids out by race, and everybody had to kind of write their race experiences. In the olden days, that was called segregation, but I won't get into all of that. But
That's right.
it is one of the reasons we're seeing more well-attended school board meetings. And then the other thing is, of course, sex education, which has been on the horizon for years. Everybody's been involved in that discussion. But really, most recently, very explicit sexual material being put into kids' curriculums, their literature curriculums. And I mean, some of the things we could not repeat on the show that are being taught to our students. And then the other issue that's been brought up is we saw this, unfortunately, this horrific incident out of Virginia where because of transgendered bathroom mandates at the local levels. We talked about non-discrimination ordinances saying, well, now you can't have biological sex bathrooms. People can choose. 2 girls in the school system in Virginia ended up raped by someone because of that. And so that was brought up to the Laughlin school board meeting where the school board at that time lied, and the dad was there of one of the victims. And the school board said, well, we're not seeing any backlash or problems or harassment or abuse occurring. And he was there and got very upset and said, well, my daughter was a victim. And so we're seeing school boards kind of hide this. And I think I want to bring this is all culminating into a national discussion, and one that we'll talk about next hour, resulting in even political upsets where local elections were never really thought much of. But really, this Washington Post article took all of this information I'm bringing to the forefront now, which I would say is the discussion parents are having, is that we're reviewing our kids' curriculums. We want to know what's being taught to them, and we want to have a say. We want to elect school board officials that are going to protect our children and not sexualize them and have drag queen story hours in the library. Is that too much to ask for our kindergartners? Those really valid parental points. And this article is entitled, Imagine a Class with 25 Kids and All of Their Parents Insist on Telling the Teacher What to Teach. The article goes on to say that it's absurd for parents to tell teachers what to teach. The result would be absolute chaos. It questions teachers' professionalism and expertise. The practical outcome of the parental rights outcry is that school board meetings is politicized, which has already been happened. And he goes on and on and on throughout this article to really, what I would say is like a great case study for what liberal media does to valid conservative arguments or just human arguments that they don't agree with. And so he goes on to say that parental rights movement has been around for decades, which it has, and been problematic for decades. But he parallels it. The example he chooses to use is racist examples. So his first tactic was to oversimplify and over-exaggerate the valid parental concerns and say what parents want is to tell the teachers what to specifically teach in the classrooms. Is that what's really happening, Jonathan and Annie?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to rewrite the first sentence of the article, Chelsey, you could read maybe this way. Imagine if you had a class with 25 students and the government told them what to teach all the time. So what parents are trying to say is, what I'd like to do is be able to be a collaborator with the teacher. This is effectively rational parents are saying this. Now, there are some irrational parents out there that are being a little bit of a hot mess in some of these school board meetings. And so, and where that's happening, folks need to have a little bit more self-control because the kids are watching the adults. And as I've said this many times on this show and other places, younger kids are watching their millennial parents, and they're watching some of our older generations parenting, and they're just entirely frustrated at adults' inability to get along. But that being conceded, I think that if you allow for the false hypothetical that this person creates in the article, right, that these amalgamous 25 kids have no worldview, no background, and no parental engagement whatsoever, that these are just nomad parents jumping in, screaming about Martin Luther King speeches. It's like, well, in this magical false hypothetical you've created, yeah, I bet that's a terrible place to teach. Right. So, but if that's let's assume for a second that not every school district and not every administrator and not every school board and not every teacher, which, by the way, would mean every undergraduate program in the country that trains our teachers or the teachers that taught our teachers are just absolute nutcases, right? Let's just assume for a second, as has been true for us for so long, that generally the teaching profession is a noble and wonderful and endearing role. And I bet all of us on here could talk about teachers in our lives that made a massive impact on us along the way. So, point of fact, should teachers have the freedom to do what they're there to do in the classroom? Generally, I would say yes. But like you were saying, Chelsey, here's the problem. When those same teachers or school districts, because it's working from a top-down standpoint as well, is saying, yeah, but we also have to have transgender story hour. Well, then as a parent, I have 100% right as a tax-paying parent to walk in and go, that sounds like a bad idea, and here's why. And at that point, that's when the debate within the public square has to be validated. So if we're to flip the hypothetical here, the alternative to parents not having a voice in the classroom is who? Is the school district, and we're going to use a blanket term here.
Sure.
It becomes a government-controlled laboratory for the shaping of little minds. And I found one statement in the article particularly disturbing, that where they talked about essentially towards the end, the more inclusive the school curriculum, the more likely students are to have an expansive understanding of the world and its diverse peoples. Man, that's only true if it's true, right? So who sets the terms? Who sets the terms on inclusiveness? Who decides for your kids, Chelsey, for who decides what the nature of inclusive language is in a schoolroom? So it's a massive oversimplification to just de-incentivize the parental voice. I think that's a bad move.
Right. I mean, like the media's favorite two plays with conservative ideas is to either call them crazy or stupid. And think of every Republican you know. One is called crazy and one is called stupid. George Bush, you know which one that was.
Yeah.
Ted Cruz can't call him stupid because he's an absolute brilliant person,
brilliant.
but he's called right. So this article does that, but it's an attack on parents. Andy, we've got a couple seconds before break, but what were your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, what are they so afraid of allowing parents to chime in and voice their thoughts and opinions and having a collaborative discussion here? And I'll just kind of end on, if they're so afraid of having parents, join in and they really want to just have control. I mean, these are the exact same people that are opposed to school choice as well. Right. So they're really just completely they're not hiding the fact they're taking it out of the hands of the parents.
That's right.
So true. We are going to continue this robust discussion after a short break.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. We have already had an incredible discussion. So if you haven't listened to the first hour, go ahead and go back to pointofview.net and listen, or go back on Facebook, Point of View Radio, and listen. I'm joined by Jonathan Teague and Annie Brown. Thanks for being with us the first hour, guys.
Hey, it's good to be here.
You bet, Chelsey. Enjoying it.
Yes, and we also have with us joining now for our last hour is Richard Lim. You guys know him as, I call him our resident historian, but he's not really resident because he's in California, very far away from the show. But he works with Prager University and also is the producer of This American President podcast, which is such a great podcast. He takes current events and really kind of goes back to a time in history where we had a president addressing a similar topic and talks about it from that perspective. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Always good to be on the show, and thanks for the very generous plug.
Always, Richard. Well, we have already started talking about this issue that I said earlier. If you were here with me a year ago and said parental rights is going to be the number 2 biggest political issue of the year behind the economy, which is typically number 1, I would not have believed you, but it has. And there was this insane article, frankly, on the Washington Post that we have on pointofview.net. And I chose this article because, first, I think it's an actual case study for how the liberals view and treat conservative ideas or valid ideas that they don't like. And so it's on there. I want us to go read it. And the first issue we said is, parents are up in arms about really 3 primary things. White shaming in the classroom. One issue, the non-discrimination ordinances with same-sex bathrooms that has resulted in multiple sexual assaults across the country. But in Virginia, 2 rapes were the result. So we've seen school board meetings well attended, and parents up in arms wanting to protect their children and allow, biological sex bathrooms to remain. And then the final issue we've seen is just really sexually explicit content, things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which happened at, our local public school library for kindergartners, things like that occurring where parents are saying, look, we need to draw some lines in the sand, and there are things we aren't willing to tolerate. And what this article did was it simplified and then exaggerated their concerns. And then it called all these parents a bunch of racists, which I thought was really offensive. They said the school board, the school curriculum is all white in context, and that's why white parents are opposed to discussions about race. That's just not true. That's a blatant lie. And they're upset because there was segregation occurring in some of these schools where children were self-selecting and dividing themselves out by race. White children are coming home saying they're upset because, they didn't know that they were inherently racist people, and they are. And they're being taught all kinds of really extreme things. And I think education and curriculum has gone from education to more of an indoctrination, and parents are asking for a balance there. I don't know that one can be had, but the bottom line is we have to engage. We have to have Christians enter this field and run for school board instead of saying, let's leave politics to the secular arenas. We have to have people voting in their local elections. I mean, there's a lot of solutions to this, but it's certainly come to the forefront. So, Richard, I know you're joining in on this, but does anything stand out to you about this debate? We'll talk about how it panned out in the Virginia race a little bit later, but just this education debate we're seeing right now.
Yeah, so you were mentioning the Washington Post headline, and there was a headline that I saw not too long ago, I think it might have been last week, that I thought was a rare moment of honesty. And the headline literally said, quote, "Parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' curriculum. They don't." Mm-hmm. And that was the headline. And when you read it, there's all sorts of this justification for basically what was a statist solution to education, that parents, okay, you need to step aside here. We're the experts. We know how to raise your children. Mm-hmm. And normally they're not that honest. But in this case, they really were. And this reflects their ideology, that essentially kids are targets to be weaponized. And one of my friends put it best. He said, what the left often does is that they push for some utopian policy when anybody, not even just conservatives, but when anybody tries to, put their hand up and say, no, stop, they then accuse the right of starting the culture war because we're standing between them and utopia. And so I think, to me, that headline really, it just said so much right there that anyone would have the audacity to say essentially, no, we, the state, own your kids' education, not you.
Right. And it's disconcerting for a number of reasons. But, education's always been something, I think, for the last few decades historically that has leaned more on the liberal side. I think we've heard for years that communists out of Russia were saying, we're going to turn your society into a socialist product, and we're going to do that through your education, and you're going to be asleep at the wheel and not even know that's the case. And we've had liberal universities indoctrinating forever. And so really, what about this is different? At first I'll get Annie's input, but then Richard, I'd love for you to chime in from your historical perspective of why now is there such an uprising? Is it just they've just gone too far, Annie?
Well, actually, Jonathan and I were talking on the break how, truly, you could argue that this is a separation of church and state issue. On the left, it's essentially a religion, and it's really only one religion is allowed to be taught, and that is of leftist ideology. If they were to only teach creationism in the schools, well, then the left would be up in arms. But, that's not the case in this situation. They're really only upset because there's a challenge of their religion. And I think that's ultimately where they've gone too far. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Richard, from your perspective, why now on this scale of liberalism being, is it just coming to the surface? People are kind of realizing how far the curriculums have gone?
I think to some extent it's a matter of inevitability. The left has nowhere to go but farther left. And that's what happens. If you have a utopian policy, if your vision is man-made utopia, that humans through government can save themselves, then you're never going to be satisfied with anything short of utopia. Mm-hmm. So I remember growing up, I went to public school my whole career. I'm almost 40, so I graduated. I was mainly in grade school in the 90s. And I do remember the liberal things that were said at the time, but it wasn't the transgender issues yet. But I think that all those things were under the surface, and they were really inevitable. So why is it happening now? I would say that it's the result of something that was going to happen eventually, and any mindset that views gender as fluid is going to come to this. It's going to come to this conclusion at a certain point. And so, yeah, for me, I can't tell you exactly why it's now, but I could tell you I do believe that it was foreordained with this kind of thinking, this utopian thinking.
That's an interesting point you raise, that it's just gone too far. But we certainly think that parents have a right to give input into their children's mind and development. I'm glad they're paying attention. We're a bunch of millennials, and guess what? Millennials are parents now, so we're here to talk about it, guys. But stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Last week, I talked about the cancel culture on college campuses. I ended my commentary with an encouraging action by Professor Robert George at Princeton, who sponsored a lecture that has been canceled at MIT. The typical reaction to that news has been, that's great, but that's an exception, not the rule. While that is true, there are more and more examples of people willing to push back against the cancel culture mob. The most visible example these days is Dave Chappelle. We can't support his gross humor, but we can support his desire to push back against the trolls trying to push his series off of Netflix. Following up on the attacks, he reminded everyone that the cancel culture mob has canceled Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, along with lots of people who aren't celebrities who have been attacked for simply saying gender is a fact. Another example is Bill Maher. He is criticized because he is weary of a younger generation acting like they're victims. More recently, he argued that words matter and that words like hate, victim, and phobic have been completely misused. Barry Weiss, who served as the op-ed editor of the New York Times, came on CNN to push back against the host about all the cancel culture offenses. We may disagree with her on many issues, though I do have a copy of her latest book on how to fight anti-Semitism. We should also support Boston Celtics star Enes Kanter, who is one of the few NBA stars to criticize China. This Muslim from Turkey has spoken out against slave labor and the 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. As Christians, we might not agree with any of the people I just mentioned, but we should support their right of free speech, and perhaps we should learn a lesson of courage from them. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable, where we are discussing parental rights and what at the forefront it is, how we got here, and also a little bit about what we can do. We're going to wrap up that discussion now with a call from Fran. I'm so excited she called in to share her experience because we said, one thing is for people to run for local school boards, to continue to vote in your local elections and really engage on the curriculum side as, for me, the number one need. That's not a teacher issue. It's a school board decision. And sometimes your Department of Education in your state actually pass those curriculums. So, Fran, thanks for calling. Do you have anything you can help give us from your experience?
Thank you for taking my call. I teach Bible at a church near a school. This is a nationwide program. I don't want to say too much about it, but we do have parental or guardian permission, and these are public school students, not during their lesson time. The prayers that they write for prayer concerns and their confusion and their fear break my heart. I've had kids say, please, God, don't let me get COVID and don't let people die of COVID anymore. And the third graders, they can read some words if you help them a bit, but they can't read a sentence and make sense of it. And the way they're teaching math, you tell them something is on page 1260 in the Bible, and they start on page 1 and turn 2 or 3 pages at a time in the third grade. We're failing these kids, and the ones who are being let down are the ones who need it the most. They're the poorest. They're the ones. Their parents are telling them one thing, and then they've been told something else at school, and they're confused.
Yeah. Yeah, Fran, I'm so grateful you called and shared that with us, because it just is such a brutal reality that the kids are the victims of this age. They're the ones that are really suffering, not just from a failure. And I'm not saying of necessarily teachers, but of our education programs and the curriculums that are being passed. And there have to be answers out there where parents are allowed to give input and lean into this. You know, Jonathan, we haven't heard from you as much on this yet, but I really would love, your thoughts on what Fran said. And then also just as a pastor and a Christian and a millennial dad with us today, it's so much to think about. It's so much to navigate. Private school's so expensive, and school choices, I hope, on the horizon. That is a Republican should own school choice, because they've been fighting for it for decades. I was lucky to be educated at a charter school, which for me was my parents was a choice because it was free, but it was a good school, and they had that option to drive me to it. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, and Andy and I kind of got into this in the break a little bit, Chelsey. I think, and Fran, if you're still listening, we certainly appreciate the investment that you're making in kids, and I think it does merit us saying one more time, Chelsey, that if you are a teacher out there, particularly a younger teacher that's maybe newer into the teaching profession, and you're watching just the chaos surrounding tenured teaching and unions and interacting with administrators and school boards, and where's my place in all this, and should I just bail out? Every time you bail out, that's 30 more kids that get added to another classroom size statistically, and it just makes our classrooms bigger, and it makes learning harder. And so I would just make an appeal to young people, education majors coming into the teaching space, jump into this and help us make it better. I was preaching at my church a weekend ago and talking about just a story of a biology teacher that I didn't even know was a Christian, that did something amazing for me in the midst of a really interesting circumstance one day. And just, it reminded me that there are Christian teachers out there. There are morally sound folks out there in the teaching space, in the school administrator space, on the school boards. They legitimately want to educate our kids. They want to see the next generation of learners move into the public space and be able to not only be told what to think, but how to think. My wife and I are fans of helping our kids understand how to think critically, certainly think biblically, but within that, be able to think critically through that biblical lens, through that biblical worldview. And I would just say this, Chelsey, that it's possible, maybe, just maybe, that we're on our way to the defragmentation of sort of these more broad strokes philosophies surrounding the education of our kids in this country today. We're a large nation. We're diverse. We're socioeconomically diverse. We're regionally diverse. The ability to decentralize some of these what have become normative practices through, say, for instance, we'll just pick on them, the Department of Education, et cetera. I think we run the risk of overgeneralizing the needs in various districts and even classrooms. And I think for teachers to have the support of parents is a big deal. To think the best of our teachers, to give them what they need. School. I mean, I think of that old. I love The West Wing. I'm just throwing it back old school for a second here, right? But early on, one of the early seasons, right, they talk about how schools should be palaces and teachers should be paid like doctors. Like, I think we need to have that conversation about supporting our schools and our teachers so that we're not honestly always sort of under-antagonizing the space, I guess is my point. So I think, Chelsey, like, if we could have that real conversation about how to be engaged and defragment some of this and strip it down to more about making it actually about the kids we're teaching and supporting them what they need on the ground, I think it becomes a different conversation at that point.
I love your input and perspective, Jonathan. You just always bring such a depth to the discussion, and that is the answer, but we can't talk about that without also talking about some recent news. We're going to switch to that, the next article, which is when parents do engage and parents are showing up at these meetings. Yes, they are getting contentious, but they're trying in the ways maybe they know how to fight. The FBI got involved. General Merrick Garland admitted last week in front of Congress that he is using the full force of federal law enforcement power in the Department of Justice to launch an investigation into parents based on a letter that was sent to them about how these school board meetings are going. And he kept saying things like threats of violence, and he could not answer to Senator Cruz what those threats are. And, they are using phrases now like domestic terrorist. So Annie, to your point earlier, when liberals view these institutions as their religion and their ideology as their religion, and you attack that religion, they're going to attack back. Richard, have you ever seen anything like that? I know interest groups get involved a lot, but the interest group sent a letter to the FBI, and now the FBI is engaging in all of these investigations and mobilized against these parents. Richard, I know with your background, you've got some insight for that.
Well, it's one of those things where things like this, when people claim this just a few years ago, they would be considered crazy. The FBI is politicized, and they're kind of just as conspiracy theorists. And I'm about as anti-conspiracy theorist as it gets. I mean, most conspiracy theories that I've heard, they don't stand up to scrutiny. But, you don't really need any more proof of how politicized these institutions are anymore, because basically, and I've worked in government, throughout my career, and CRT, there in every agency, there is usually an equal opportunity office that is, first of all, usually the employee there, the workforce that works in those offices have no diversity at all in terms of their ideological perspective or their racial background, and yet they're the people that are tasked with enforcing diversity throughout the entire government. Every agency has these people, and basically CRT is what they're pushing everywhere. The CRT agenda, the transgender agenda. You have to comply if you work in government. That's the way it is, and that's seeped into every aspect of basically our society now, because that's what they're enforcing in education. And so it's one of those things that's very scary. For the first time, this past few weeks, for the first time in my life, I'm finally reading the book 1984, because anyone who's into history, political science, whenever they hear that I haven't read it, they're like, "You haven't read it," so I'm reading it. And he predicted that, and he had seen already, during the Hitler years, that totalitarian governments weaponize children. And that's one of the most effective tactics. And he wrote that book in the late 40s, which was the same time Mao Zedong took over. And that's exactly what he did in the Cultural Revolution. They weaponized children. So that's what you're seeing here. Again, I'm one of the last people that would ever claim that, that's a big conspiracy theory. But guess what? This is where we are right now as America. And I think we need to step back and just say, hold on, how the heck in America, how did we get to the point where we have to affirm the right of a parent to be a parent?
Right. That's
scary to me. I mean, that's
it certainly
horrifying.
Should be a wake-up call, Richard. I mean, I think that's when we're looking at all of this, we're trying to signal to everyone that we're talking about our children in society. We're talking about education. We're talking, you name it. Then the last year, our world looks completely different, and it's not COVID's fault. I mean, we're seeing a main driver of that. So don't go anywhere. We're going to continue the discussion when we get back after this break. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net, where you can read these articles and more.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back to Point of View. Today is the Millennial Roundtable edition, and I am joined by some stellar millennial brains today. I'm so grateful. We have Richard Lim calling in from California on the line. Thanks for being here, Richard.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
Always. And then we also have Annie Brown, who comes to us from Human Coalition. She's a coworker of mine, a friend of mine. I'm so grateful you joined us today.
It's fun to be here.
Yes, and we have Jonathan Teague. He's the minister to married adults with Prestonwood Baptist Church. He does great work, great ministry, but always brings such a really refreshing perspective to the show. So I'm really grateful to have you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chelsey. Loving the conversation today.
I am too. We've been a little bit everywhere. I mean, I would say we had a big rights discussion the first hour and a half. We talked about the right to life. We talked about parental rights. We've talked about all of those things, but we're going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about a small governor's race out of Virginia last week. You may have heard about, but Republican Youngkin, he won the governor's race out of Virginia. And I think it goes hand in hand with this discussion about parental rights we've been having, because really that was at the forefront of his election. We talked about there being 2 victims in public school out of Virginia due to their transgender bathroom policy. There were two girls that were raped by the same student, and that was allowed to happen, and the school board covered it up. And so education, we've been saying, has been just such a front-running issue. And Virginia was the first time politically that was really tested and proven. I mean, he ran on education. It's easily an issue that Republicans can own in the school choice context. Republicans don't let Democrats own that for you. But that's not just something that resonates, I think, with what everyone assumes, white suburban women who did flip. And one of the articles we have on pointofview.net discusses, that white suburban women who really abandoned the field of the Republicans during the Trump era are back in Virginia and in double digits, I think 13-point increase, voted for Republicans. And so they attributed that obviously a lot to his stance on school and education and scaling back, so many of the socialist policies that are being taught there. And I think that is true, but I also want to say that school choice is a minority issue. That is an issue that would greatly expand and assist minority communities. And it's something that really resonates well with a whole host of diverse demographics. And so I'd be remiss if I left that out. But what do you think, Annie, I know that you're up to speed on all of this. I don't want to make too much of his victory, although we'll get there. But, on the issues and the plays that he ran, some of the political tactics, the economy being one of the first issues people designated voting for, and then the second being education. Do you think there are things that the Republican Party as a whole should be paying attention to when it comes to this race?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you talked about the point flip. I mean, and that wasn't just with white suburban voters. I mean, that was across the board among all races and both among men and women. So I think that's interesting to note. And I would say that your middle class voter is very aware of what's been going on with inflation. So the economy, touching on that, but I think more than anything, the mask is off on the left in terms of who they want raising your kids, and it used to be in more of a subtle way, but really it's so blatant now, when all Youngkin had to do was state exactly what McAuliffe had been saying, which is that he doesn't believe that parents' rights usurp the government. And so ultimately, I think it's very interesting and very telling that it's so blatant at this point. And I think that, Democrats are going one of two ways now. I mean, they kind of have to split by either going, digging their heels in and saying, oh, nope, this is the right move and trust us, government knows best. Or, they have to take a step back and be like, hey, maybe this rhetoric isn't working. But, from there, I mean, what other cards do they have to play? I mean, obviously they're losing on the economy front, and with education being lost unless they change their direction, the only card they have left to play is the race card, which I think people are wise to at this point. And again, you can see that with the point flip, where that was across all races. And I think that's also very telling, and it will look very interesting as this midterm, so to speak. It didn't forecast good things for the left.
Right.
It didn't. And, both parties really, it's incumbent on both parties to take these, I call them midterm elections. You don't want to make too much of them, which I know Richard is going to, so like the first thing you're going to say probably, but I like to make too much of them because
too much of
I know, Richard. I was going to say, I'm such an eternal optimist. I always make too much of these things. But, Richard, you're here to tone me down. I will say that it is incumbent on both parties to be paying attention because from the Republican standpoint, Trump was a little bit more distant in this election. So if we're looking at political strategy, maybe the right strategy is to allow white suburban women who are fired up about education right now because those issues are so extreme, allowing them to feel safe to come back to the party, voting their predominant vote, their majority of the voting bloc. They're 52% of the voting bloc. And, that's some interesting tactics. Richard, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it shows a lot of the bankruptcy of the Democrats right now in terms of both talent and political strategy. That first, that you even had a guy like Terry McAuliffe running, Clintonista, who's been around D.C. for how many years, and me being from California, he was the Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown ran in 1976 for president, and he was still governor a few years ago. So you're talking about a short bench. And the fact that their strategy was basically to run against Donald Trump. I mean, somehow Democrat emails, you know how you get signed up for lists that you have no idea how you got signed up for. So I got signed up for Democrat and Republican lists, and every single Democrat list in these emails asking for donations was the Trump-led Republicans are trying to take over Virginia. And that's all they ran off of in Virginia, that, radical Trumpists are trying to take over Virginia, hiding from their own agenda. And so one of my friends once said all Republicans had to do was just point to who they are and just say, okay, they're going to run against Trump, but I'm going to point to Terry McAuliffe and just tell you this, do you make it about your opponent? That's what we learned in Virginia. Make it about who they are, because this is who they are. And so, yes, I think that's the big lesson to take from this. And I don't know if Democrats will learn from it because they have so much Trump derangement syndrome. They can't help but talk about Trump.
I know. It's so true. We can't. I read something that said, that the media used to say so much that everybody hated President Trump, but it was largely media driven and generated. But, the abysmal Biden Kamala Harris approval rating that's coming out, even like as low as 28% today, that's not media driven. That's just genuine issue driven and American public driven. Jonathan, when you're looking at this election, are there any takeaways for the Republican Party or the Democrat parties that the country should be paying attention to for a state election?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was in Virginia right as the vote was coming just several days ago, and I was in a part of Virginia that I think undoubtedly went Governor Youngkin's way. I do think, and I don't know to what extent Richard would be comfortable with these sort of illusions, thinking ahead, but it is fascinating, and we shouldn't make too much of it to an extent. However, I think it is interesting to note that Virginia is a state that, for it to go in the governor's office and in many other sectors of Virginia, the political spectrum of Virginia as well, for it to turn and flip the way it has, I think that is interesting. It's noteworthy for sure. It's a state that I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's a state that Biden carried in 2020. I think the fact that you had, I'm trying to remember all the heavy hitters they brought in. So I think President Obama took a swing through. Yes. I think Vice President Harris was there. I think President Biden made his way as well. And so that is the vanguard of the Democratic Party. Certainly in the established, people you should listen to. And when they show up, that means we care. And when they show up, it means that we've got this guy's back. And so for the vanguard to come through and then for it doesn't look like it came through. Could be a nod to the fact that on the national level, so much of President Biden's domestic agenda is stalled and potentially failing. We'll see in the next month or so if that brings true. But then if you get into the state politics, the matters of what people in Virginia care about, right now I'm sitting in Texas right now, but there are Virginians in Virginia that think a lot like some Texans in Texas. And so you start to see how much more broadly, to Richard's point, the message can appeal to folks that generally are like, hey, I might not agree with you on all these other things, but I really don't like this particular rhetoric. And if you can shine a bright light on that, maybe there's foreshadowing in 2024 here. Maybe McAuliffe has a little bit of Biden in him where it's like, just trust me, right? And Youngkin's like, yeah, I don't think we do. And so if there's a softer rhetoric from what Trump brings, but still some, if you'll allow this, some Trumpian platform at play here, maybe there's a lesson there. I don't know. We'll see as time goes on.
And don't forget, though, I'll just make a plug for an election audit because we want that to be a bipartisan issue where we're saying we want honest elections. And so even though Republicans won Virginia, don't forget that Virginia lowered every threshold voting requirement they had in an extreme way this year. There were no voter IDs required. So let's have a shout out for an election audit, but I'm certainly glad to see the outcome. We'll be back after this short break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsey Youman, your guest host today, and we are really breaking down, of course, the midterm of the midterms, as I like to call it, but the Republican victory that took place last Wednesday following Republican Glenn Youngkin's victory in the governor's race there. And of course, everyone wants to read the tea leaves on this and see what's going to happen and be predicting. the next midterm election, which is really going to be next year. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, he came out swinging. I mean, he took his victory lap and then he took another lap. And he's really excited about the outcome in Virginia. I always say that we know midterms are kind of a referendum on the sitting president and administration and how things are going. It's really a question of how big of a referendum is it, in which direction. And he is predicting, though, Minority Leader McCarthy, that the Republicans could flip more than 60 House seats next midterm election. He made sure to call out his dear friend, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and mentioned that she happened to have lost 63 of the Democrat seats last time she was the speaker, and that they were pushing policies the country didn't care for. And he's essentially saying that if President Biden won the seat by about 16 points, or in a competitive race, and he predicted as many as 70 of those seats are up for grabs or competitive for next year. So that's a lot of big talk right there. But I think it's worth noting, because what we're seeing is as we've discussed on this show, just how as extreme the Democrats have gone in the last year. Everything from passing trillions and trillions of dollars of budget packages to inflation is up. The economy is bad. No one is even blaming COVID anymore. Everyone's just freaked out by the Democrat policies that speak for themselves right now. There's not as much middle ground to be had, I would say, even as there was a year ago. So, Richard, we're going to start with you. What do you make in terms of the big picture here for the midterms?
Yeah, so even though, historians kind of have this constant sense of, throwing caution in there and everything, and I think that that's a good thing. At the same time, there is reason to be optimistic for the reasons just stated earlier, the fact that the Democrats have a very thin bench. Right now, their lead in the House in the House is about as thin as it gets. I mean, they have barely 51% of all the seats there. Republicans just need to flip 5 seats, and they have it. So, and a lot of how things will turn out will be based on what are the candidates that they're going to recruit. Are they going to recruit good candidates? Are they going to recruit candidates that alienate the voting population? And so I think all those things give us reason to be optimistic, as long as the party does a good job of recruiting good people, and thankfully we do have a lot of talent. I think as far as the Democrats go for the presidential election, even though, yes, 3 years is a political eternity, but they have to start planning now. And quite frankly, I mean, I've heard people, Karl Rove said not too long ago that he thinks the Democrats are going to have to do what they did in 1896. Question, what did they do in 1896? Well, their president was so unpopular, Grover Cleveland, that they basically they could have run him again in 1896, but they lost 120 plus seats in the midterms that year.
That's embarrassing.
Twice the amount Obama lost. So that's a huge turnover. So they just went with a completely new slate of candidates in 1896, meaning to say that they're banking on somebody who will have to emerge and basically save the party in 2024. So, that's the forecast, and it's really up to Republicans to not drop the ball at this point.
I think that's interesting you say that, because really here what we have is the Democrats have ostracized major factions of their own base. So they're really hanging their hat on some loser issues for their own base. One of those being, everybody assumes minority voters vote Democrat, but that's, first of all, not true. Second of all, the Democrats have overestimated support for their immigration policies, even among minority voters. We have, for the first time in the state of Texas, blue districts who've been blue for over 100 years, Latino districts going red. And that is because their communities are being inundated with border issues and migration issues, and these are Hispanic voters. And so I do think that that's one issue we could see their base depart from them on, aside from all the other ones we've talked about on the show. Also, I think vaccine mandates majorly backfire among minority voters, and that is because minority voters do tend to be more reticent to get the vaccine for really good reasons. So, Annie, do you agree with some of that analysis, or want to add to it?
No, I mean, I just entirely agree, and I understand the caution and being overly optimistic with the, as you call it, the midterms. Because I mean, it's easy to really take it for granted and walk away thinking that you're miles ahead. One thing I want to comment on is I think this also indicates, along with previous presidential elections, is that the polls clearly don't mean a whole lot. Because I mean, if you look at New Jersey, it was never ever supposed to be that close, and the polls were saying, within a week of the election, that it was not supposed to be that close. So there's a lot to feel optimistic about if we look at the trends, and I think to what you were saying, the Democrats really need to evaluate what they're standing on here, because their issues are backfiring, and I think that they're taking their voting blocks for granted. So they're really going to have to evaluate that if they're going to try and build any momentum between now and next year's midterms.
Good point. And Jonathan, I want to hear from you, but also, Jonathan, your views on the Senate, because there is a little bit of talk whether the Senate, it's so close already, the margin there, which direction that could go.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we're dealing there with a non-majority in the Senate if you consider the tie-breaking vote as of today. And I think, just circling back to Richard's point, I just parenthetically just nerd out for a second. When Richard started talking about Grover Cleveland, I got real excited because that put you 4 years away from a Teddy Roosevelt somewhere. So if you know the story, how all that goes, and so, but historical perspective, like always, it matters, and it should help us get a window into where we could go. And I do think so. Again, Chelsey, whether you're talking about matters related to the Senate, which I think, frankly, could be I don't know a good way of putting this, but there could be a political secret sauce there for the Republican Party if more intentionality gets poured into the Senate races, and I'm sure there will be. But these House races as well, the implications are significant. That many seats flipped in that window of time could be, it could be massive, and it could have massive implications, and point out, I think, where the mind and the mood of a lot of these parts of the country where maybe they were reticent to vote for Trump in 2020. We'll never really know, but maybe they were reticent to vote for him for whatever reasons. And so a non-voter, a vote for Biden, maybe that swings back in 2024 based off what happens. And so if Youngkin's election, if his win is some kind of foreshadowing into where maybe people, and even the article you gave us earlier pointed out, just parents being at home during COVID and being exposed to the realities of their kids, both their learning and what they were learning. Maybe there is an awareness gap that's closing here. And amongst the minds of the electorate, particularly for young voters, which we always, every cycle, we want to get them motivated, we want to get them out. Well, maybe as millennials are becoming parents, there's 80 million of us. And as we are becoming older and we're becoming parents, maybe the realities of adulthood are setting in. And maybe conservatism does have a message there that could create a great underpin to where we want to go. Now, this is pie in the sky a little bit, I know that. But maybe there's messaging, and if you can match the candidate with the message, and they can communicate on a level that makes sense to people, maybe there is a formula there that we drifted from a little bit, and maybe this gives us a chance to come back.
You raised an interesting point that there's maybe a lot of middle ground here. There's a lot of middle ground to be gained. And, the name of the game when it comes to these campaigns is always keep your base, but extend to the middle voter. And I think both, if the Republicans play it right, they could be able to do that. Well, thank you guys so much for the show today. Richard, Jonathan, and Annie, we've loved having you guys and your perspective. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net and read about our articles or more. Thanks for being here.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently